Are you finding that you are losing your audience's attention as soon as they start listening to your podcast? This is something that a lot of podcasters struggle with. They look at their completion rates, they look at how much of an episode their audience is listening to, and they get frustrated because the audience is dropping off at the 20 to 50% mark, or even 60 to 70% mark. This can be something that can actually impact whether you continue podcasting. So this episode is going to be really impactful, especially if you are someone who does solo episodes and wants to make sure that you are grabbing and keeping your audience's attention. Please join me in welcoming Emily Aborn back to the podcast. She has been on the show 4 times now. Today, we're going to be talking through how to keep your audience's attention, your listeners' attention, and show up best for them. Hello, Emily. Welcome back to another episode. I want to say this is your 4th time on the show. So thank you so much for coming back. If you could start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and a bit about your podcast.
Well, thanks for having me back. I always love collaborating with you. And as aforementioned, my name is Emily Aborn. I'm a copywriter, which I always like to just define what it is in case somebody thinks it's that little C that goes at the bottom of your website. It is not that. I actually put the words that go on to people's websites and also in blogs and things like that. My podcast is the Content with Character podcast, and it's all about, I'd say, out of the box ideas on marketing and content marketing and visibility.
I love that. And you did have a podcast before that you have since sunsetted. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because your podcasting journey is pretty extensive.
Yeah, so that was called She Built This, and I started that in 2019. Was a interview-based podcast, so I would bring on like women entrepreneurs to kind of like tell their stories and give tools and tips and takeaways and things like that. And it was a great journey. And now I'm having a really fantastic time in the guest seat when I want to collaborate with other podcasters.
And that's something you've been doing a lot of lately. And this is something that I've been wanting to ask you. So I'm just going to ask you now because I think it's relevant to this conversation. And that is, I know for me, when I focused really heavily on being a guest on other people's podcasts, I saw my numbers in my downloads go up astronomically. We've seen it with clients. And so I'm curious if you've looked at your numbers to see what kind of impact it's making on your podcast specifically.
It definitely has increased. I'm looking forward to more increasing as more of them go live. But yeah, it definitely has made an impact. And I think I have to give our friend Lisa Zarotny credit for this because she's the one that reminded me at the end of every episode when they ask how you want to connect people to connect with you to say, since you're already listening to a podcast, it's an easy jump over to my podcast. And that was honestly what I needed to practice saying over and over and over again.
Yeah, it's one of the best ways, I think, to get people to, like, new people to start listening to your podcast. We're seeing this big shift on social media, and we've been seeing it for a while now, but that is when people are on social media, they're not so much, especially if you're looking at Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, etc., LinkedIn maybe, but on these other ones where it's not so much educational or informative, it's more entertaining, that people are not searching for new content to absorb. They're kind of there just either doom scrolling or they are there trying to use it as an escape and just kind of scrolling through the reels or the TikToks, etc. And so as podcasters, when we're trying to promote our podcast on there, it's hard to capture their attention, to keep their attention, to shift them from their podcast app over to their podcast player. If you don't mention the podcast player that they like to or prefer to listen to podcasts on, you already lose them. Like, there's so many different elements to sharing about your podcast on social media that I think we're losing a lot of the people that could be potential listeners. But by being a guest on other people's podcasts, you're able to very quickly and easily get them to know you, like you, trust you, share your message. They get a vibe about you, and then you can send them over to your podcast. Now, one thing that I love about your podcast specifically is that it is exclusively solo episodes. And so I know what I'm seeing, especially with our clients, with my own podcast, is that when you have a podcast that has a lot of guests versus you have a podcast that has a lot more solo episodes. For the guest downloads, you'll see hills, right? So it's like up, down, because people are coming either for the guest and then they maybe stay a little longer. But for the most part, they're just going over there to check out a guest that you had on if they're finding you for the first time. Whereas if you have a solo podcast, you'll see more of a big hill, so an increase in the number of people that are listening, and then it tapers off to a pretty like regular number with progressive growth, but it's higher than your previous trajectory was. And so I'm curious if that's something that you notice when, like, by having a podcast that had guests on versus something that has more solo, if you're seeing kind of those numbers as well.
I don't think I've looked that granularly, but I will after this because you broke it down really nicely. And I just want to say, I think you're right. And I think it's for a lot of reasons. And it's not all your guest's fault. So don't, throw your guests under the bus there. But I think it's for a lot of reasons. And I also think it's sometimes harder to provide a nice structure. Like some hosts are just more adept at it than others. And I think you're really good at that. Like you ask questions that give it kind of a nice container, but not all hosts are skilled at doing that. And so that's a skill that as a host you can learn and improve over time. And then I think you would start to see a little bit less of that.
Yes. So now you have to tell me. And maybe we'll do like a little, here's what happened in the show notes. But now I'm curious, now that I broke that down, what your numbers are saying, because I don't think that people really look that granularly. And so here's your encouragement to look that granularly. I know our mutual friend, Lisa, I produce her podcast, and we were looking at her numbers and looking at her guests versus her solos. And in the month where she did more solo episodes and was a guest on a podcast that then sent people back to her show, saw tremendous growth. And we noticed that people were going back through her catalog of solo episodes in that month and a half after that guest episode went live, more so. So they were skipping the guest episodes because they were like, oh, that's just a person. I like Lisa. I want to get to know her. And so we found that really interesting. And so that encouraged her to say, oh, I want to do more solo episodes. I want to be seen more as an expert. And also I can be more picky. I'm at a lot of episodes here and I don't need you really as a guest. And so like you get to say and determine all of that by looking at the numbers. So numbers are obviously where I love to look to determine all that fun stuff.
I think the numbers help you really advocate for your listener, and make sure that you are constantly giving your listener what they came here for. So I think it's awesome.
Yes. So I mentioned getting people's attention and keeping it. That is something that I think a lot of people struggle with. In my head, I think, okay, where to begin? If you're someone who's like, I'm seeing people, maybe you're looking at your completion rates of your episodes, meaning how much of an episode people are listening to. You're seeing 20 to 30%. You're grabbing their attention initially, but you're not keeping it. Maybe you're seeing a lot of people drop off within the 5 minutes. My question would be, do you have ads in the first 5 minutes? How long is your intro, right? Like there's a lot of different things that we can go into, but content wise, where do you recommend that people start when they're thinking of, all right, I want to grab people's attention and I also want to keep their attention?
Okay, so first I want to rest us all assured that like when people are distracted, it's somewhat our fault and our responsibility. And the human brain is prone to distraction. Like actually as a brain, your brain is just wandering around like 50% of the time, bumping into various things. So you don't have control. You already like have lost 50% of their brain power, right? So just know that going in, like the things we're going to give you are helpful and useful. And there's some of it that's just totally out of your control. It's funny. I did an episode on how to keep your audience and listeners engaged because I went to a conference where this woman like lost me and I watched it real time and I was like, oh my God, it was crazy. So I did an episode on it and I used the SEO keyword, how do I stop getting distracted? It is one of my top ranking keywords on my website. So that should tell you everything you need to know. Like we are just kind of walking around in this world. And then with social media, there's lots of noise out there. So one thing I love, and this is something that a lot of podcasters can do pretty easily, is just thinking of repurposing your content. So if you do have longer episodes, like how else can you break it out into like reels or shorts, or even repurposing it into emails or blogs or other ways that people are going to interact with the content, especially when it's something like so good. You're like, I do not want anyone to miss this. I'll use an email that Alicia sent today as an example. She sent this email. It's like super impactful. And now people sometimes tell me like, I can't read email. You know, they're distracted when they read email. So how could Alicia then take that same email and turn it into something audio for people to listen to? So it's just thinking about like, well, if they're going to be distracted anyway, what are some other ways that I can also be thinking of getting this content to them? And like the huge advantage for us when we do that, when we repurpose things, is A, it saves us time. You don't have to come up with 10 million pieces of content. You can just use your podcast as your pillar. And then B, it brings like, what I love is it brings this level of cohesion to everything that we're doing. And additionally, that takes out the distraction of like, what is this person even saying? Or what are they even selling me? Or what do they even do? Or what's their business? Like it takes out those questions, which can be very distracting. And I think that actually brings me to another point, is making sure when your listeners, like especially if you're engaging with new listeners, making sure that you're taking a second to like let them know who you are. Because I can't tell you how many podcasts I will start listening to, and like 3 episodes in, I'm like, I still have no idea like what this person why are they talking about this? So I think it's always helpful. Like, just it does not have to be long. I get loquacious, obviously, but I try to keep my intro like so. Like, I'm Emily Aborn. This is what I do, and if you want to learn more about it, go to emilyaborn.com. But I like to just personally like greet people because I think we all need to be kind of on the same page. So I'll pause there. Those are 2 ideas. I have many more.
I love this. So repurposing, I have found to be something that I'm having a lot of discussion with clients around. Is, okay, you put that episode out. We're seeing your Buzzsprout. That's the hosting platform that we use for our clients' podcast. We're looking at your Buzzsprout numbers. What about your YouTube numbers? Yeah. Wow, that episode had 600 views. That's not seen on Buzzsprout. You're going to have to combine those numbers to say, oh, a lot of people said they shared this episode, but I'm only seeing 150 downloads on that episode. That's not much more than we typically see. Okay, well, what's going on over at YouTube? What's going on in these other places? How many views did that blog post get on your website? Were people just watching on your website? Were people just consuming it there because you have it linked there as well? For me, I did my solo podcast, Successful Podcasting Unlocked, which at this point, I believe has sunsetted since we have 53 episodes. But from that, what I was able to do was take one 10-minute podcast episode, turn that into a full LinkedIn article that I then made into a LinkedIn article newsletter. So it shows up as a newsletter for people to their email from LinkedIn, which is really awesome. And it also shows up as an article on like, hey, this is Alicia's page and here's the things that she knows for LinkedIn. And so having that, I actually saw a huge increase in the subscribers to my LinkedIn newsletter that was rivaling my own regular newsletter. And so when I think about what is the information that I'm sending my people, all right, this podcast episode got 50 downloads. How many views did that LinkedIn article get? How many views did the blog post that is then repurposed, another version of that content of my transcript, turned into a blog post? Well, how many views did that get? What kind of interactions did I get from the social media posts that I did? Oh, wow, I got someone who said, hey, I would love you to be on my podcast to talk about this topic. Cool. That is a win. Who cares about the downloads, right? Like, depending on what your goals are. But if I'm just looking at those 50 downloads, I can get really discouraged really fast. And I think that we really have to consider, all right, I've got that audience there, but what is the bigger picture? Let's do a bird's eye view of where our content really is instead of just saying my download numbers are low. Maybe your audience is engaging with you in different ways and wants to engage with you in different ways. And you need to figure out, one, do you want to keep podcasting in this way? Do you want to switch over to a different form of content? Or do you want podcasting to be your pillar, like Emily said, and then repurpose that into these other forms? So I think that it is such an utilized strategy. And I get it. Time is short. We don't have a lot of time to put into repurposing a bunch of stuff, but there are so many tools out there. Literally, if you have the transcript and you have an AI chat-based tool, you can repurpose it into a ton of different content within a very limited amount of time that you might have. So it is possible. And I would highly encourage people, if you have solo episodes, please give it a shot. Just try it once, see how you like it.
And I think that's where it's all about removing those barriers. Like you said, like link in bio, and then they go to the link in your bio and they're like, well, it's not on my app, right? So this just removes a lot of those barriers for people. And I think that's what reducing distractions is all about. It's just making it easier for your content to be engaged in. So another way to do that is to not use a whole bunch of word salads or word circles or industry jargon or complex language. It's why I always say, like, I know a lot of people know what a copywriter is, but a lot of people don't. So it's why I just always simply say, I'm the person that puts words on the website, right? Because I don't want there to be any confusion right up front and like limit people's interaction with what we're about to say next. So it's thinking about the person on the other side and just saying like, how can I make this like a lot easier, a lot plainer? If you're like, oh, I just really want to get all prose, like use all this prose in here and speak like a Dickensian author, like don't do it. Just keep it simple.
Don't do it. If you learn nothing else, don't do that.
Yeah, so that's really, really helpful. And one easy way to do this, which I think we can all incorporate more of, and we hear it all over the place, but is to use stories as examples. It's really helpful because everybody's brain kind of works in a different way. So some people like to hear you apply something. They're like, okay, give me the step by step. Like, tell me how that would actually break down and apply it. Alicia just did that when we talked about repurposing. Some people need to hear a story about repurposing, and that's going to help them to understand the concept. So like thinking even about like, okay, how can I share the same point in a kind of different way? I like to do this real simple in my shows. I sort of structure it like this. So I'll say like point, example, story, point again. So I kind of just summarize it all up in one tidy little package. And every single point I go through is going to be in that exact same format. So they don't even really realize, I think, why it works, but it works.
Yes, that is so impactful. And I think that people who are, especially at the beginning of podcasting, where maybe you've never had to talk in front of a mic, especially by yourself, it can feel like, do I need to go off of a script? I sound like a robot when I read a script. Should I do an outline? I get distracted. How can I format this outline? What's the best way to do this? And so finding a way and a strategy and a kind of rhythm that works for you, whether that's the one Emily just suggested or something else, I think really helps to be able to break it down in a way that your audience is going to be able to follow, which is the point, right? We want your audience to be able to follow your thoughts, follow where you're going, which is why a lot of the side tangents that are in my podcast tend to get taken out because they're not relevant to the conversation. They can be really distracting, and it's just my brain being like, squirrel, other thought, wait, no, take that out. We don't need to do that, right? And so it's okay to show up that way when you're recording, but when with the final product, with the thing that's going out into the world, you want to make sure that it's a cohesive, neatly packaged idea. Now, you said it was point, example, story. What do you do? Because this is something that I think a lot of people struggle with when you don't have a story or you maybe don't have a good example that would be relevant to your audience. What are some things that you can do there?
So then I might not use that structure. I might use a different structure, which is like another one you could use is kind of like a step-by-step for each point. There's actually a few common ones. Like you can literally just put this into Google of just like structures for speaking. And it's really helpful, but it kind of gives you a few ideas and then you can find the one that works best for you. And I'm not even saying everyone has to do that, but I do for myself, I make an outline and I keep it pretty on the outline. Now, like you, I have side tangents sometimes. And as I'm working on it, I have to ask myself, like, sometimes you really like your side tangent too. It's like as a writer, sometimes you write something and you're like, but this sentence is so good, but it's like totally fluffy, right? So you have to have the advocacy for your listener to be able to like backspace, delete. You can always use it someplace else. Like a lot of times if I am deleting a sentence that I just love, or a client's like, that doesn't really fit with my brand, I will just take that sentence and put it into a little like, I have like a special document just for these dead sentences, and I will bring them back to life when they're ready to come back to life. But that way they're not gone. Like I think that can help you too. Like if you do tend to go off on side tangents, or you're like, oh my God, this was actually like 3 topics in one episode. How many times has that happened? Right.
Yeah.
So that's another thing is just keeping it like one episode focus on one thing and not trying to like, I'm going to jam pack this with 7 different ideas. You can put those ideas, you should put those ideas into other episodes, and people would be so much happier for it because now each one is going to be so much like more robust, right? So think of it like that. Like take all those little sentences, put them someplace else. And when you rebuild them again, they can be like whole like worlds in and of themselves, whole stories in and of themselves.
Yes, I love that so much. And just thinking about the times where I've looked at an outline and been like, we need to cut this in half.
Yeah.
Like, there's way too much. I'm covering too much. I'm also maybe assuming too much about my audience, which I can do quite often because in my brain, they think like I do. They are as into the industry as much as I am. They know as much as I do. And so I did find myself saying, obviously, a lot in these episodes where I was doing solo episodes. And my team was like, Alicia, it's not actually obvious. And my brain was like, wait, it's not? Okay. Then I had to reassess how I approach my podcast episodes, how I approach those solo episodes of like really understanding what it is that my audience needs or wants from me. So, yes, we've all had those episodes where we've said, this is a little too much information. Let's cut this in half. And I would highly recommend that, especially if you're a new podcaster. Don't feel like you have to, especially in those first 10 episodes, give your audience everything.
Yeah.
Those can be so basic level cornerstone content, like defining topics, getting to the heart of the issues that your clients or your listeners are struggling with, focusing on how to get them from point A to B, not A to Z, right? Those are the things that you want to do in a podcast episode. Because when you think about how people consume podcast content, they're doing other things. Most likely they're cleaning their house, they're walking their dog, they're driving to and from something. Some people shower while they listen to podcasts. Like they're doing other things. And so you cannot give them too much information to take action on, especially if you have a podcast where you're telling them to take action. And so it's important that we are giving them digestible episodes to keep them and keep their brains focused on what it is that we're talking about. Now, I'm curious about the size of your episodes. I listen to your podcasts, but for people who don't, we have clients that do anywhere from 10-minute solo episodes to 45-minute episodes. What is kind of your thought process on time-wise, keeping your audience focused on the topic?
Yeah, I had somebody recently who heard I did a solo show and she's like, oh, it must be super short, right? I'm like, not really. So I'm trying. I will say that I'm trying to keep them 25 to 30 minutes. That's like my new kind of goal for myself. And to your point of the wanting people to take action and knowing that they're doing other things, I want to share something that I do because my episodes tend to be a little bit longer as solo shows. So if I'm giving a list or things I want them to take action on or things I want them to reflect on, whatever, actually, it doesn't matter. Any resources I'm giving them, I will say at the top of the episode, all of the resources are in the show notes, or all of the questions are in the show notes, or the whole thing is written out. Just click in the show notes, right? Like I want to give them that right at the top. So if they are doing something else like driving their car, they can rest their mind at ease knowing that it's like already written out somewhere, and they don't have to like, oh my God, where's a pen in my glove compartment? Well, I'm like going down 95, going 95, right? Like, I don't want that. And the other thing I do in that is the end of the episode, I'll do it again and say like, this is in the show notes, so don't forget to go there. So that I do think, like when I'm listening to a podcast and they have a whole bunch of like exciting questions, and or I know when you do your podcast predictions for the new year, I'm like, I want to write these down, and I will. I have a Google Doc from last year that's like, these are Alicia's predictions. So I know I'm going to want to do that. So having them all written out is just like super, super helpful, right? Then I just am like, oop, oop, cut, paste. I can put them right into my little storage, my idea storage. So I think that's helpful. I hope it's helpful, but I think that's a good way to do it too. And then one other thing, when an episode is kind of longer, because I think people can look at that timestamp and be like, okay, that's long, right? At the top of the episode, another thing I'll do is say like, I'm going to give you 3 ideas for XYZ, or I'm going to give you 6 ideas for XYZ, or here's where I'm going today. And then again at the end, like sum it all up one more time. That's also another little like tool we can all use, like speaking, guesting. We can preview things and saying like, here's where I'm going with this, and then recap it again at the end. Because if you did lose somebody somewhere in there, they can listen to that recap and be like, oh, I missed point number 5 somehow. Go back up to point number 5 and listen again.
That's so powerful. And I think that it's such a great strategy, especially for people who are mapping out solo episodes and are like, I don't know what I'm doing. We've all been there. It's okay. Yeah. And to your point of the 2025 predictions, I always have it into a freebie on my website as like a PDF, and with the highlights is like, here are the main predictions, and then here are all of my thoughts. And then also here are additional resources that relate to this topic. So if I'm talking about marketing, here are 5 podcast episodes that are going to help you fine tune your marketing in 2025. Even though they're past episodes, then I'm getting people back into the content and into the education. It's such an, especially if you just take the transcript and then you put it over into Canva. Like, it's just so easy to do that I don't think we realize how easy it is to be able to just literally, if it's even in the show notes, here are the predictions, here are the general thoughts, here's a blog post, right? There's so many different ways that we can present this information to our audience to keep them digesting the information and not getting easily distracted.
Yeah, I love that you do that. And it kind of brought me to like one kind of last thing is, if you are using visuals in your podcast, I don't know, I don't do it, but I've heard people like they'll have a video up or their screen up and they're like talking about what's on the screen. Now, I have one of these brains where if somebody's describing something to me, my brain shorts out. Like, I'm just like, I don't know until I see it. Like, I can't have any image in my brain. I can read a book, but like if someone's talking about that, it doesn't work for me. So just giving them like some place in the show notes, like the Venn diagram is in the show notes, right? You can click it and it will pop up and you'll be able to actually see it for yourself. Or it's the link to the Instagram post where I did that is in the show notes. Super helpful. Now that I say that, I'm like, don't send them to Instagram because they will get distracted. But putting a visual in the show notes, if you're going to be using visuals, is super helpful. Or putting it on YouTube and saying this so you can see it for yourself, you know? So just really advocating. I think it all comes down to removing the barriers for them to be able to access the information, kind of building that web of different ways for them to get to it, and then really advocating for them every step of the way. So it's hard to do. It's a practice. It's a skill. And I think that as we get better at it, we'll find some of those retention numbers going up, some of those listen percentages, you know, going to 100% or 110%. And that's exactly what we want.
Yes, we want people to listen through the whole thing. We want them to go back and listen again, which is what that 110% would be for anyone who's like, what in the world are you talking about? And yes, the visuals, even thinking about audiobooks, especially kids' audiobooks, like children's books, they will say, here's the link to the PDF with all of the pictures for the book. That way you can visually look through it with your kid as they're listening, and even like accompanying workbooks, right? That come with more how-to educational books. So there's so many ways that we can take that and say, okay, how can I use this as a way for my audience with this audio narrative to be able to present it in the way that makes sense for my audience to be able to digest it. And yes, I love all of this. Emily, this has been so helpful. I think that people, I mean, literally, if you just take one tip and one idea from what Emily said, you will be able to make a better impact on your audience, and you're going to see your audience more engaged with your content, which is always the goal. Where can people find you, get to know you, hang out with you?
Okay, well, since you're already listening to a podcast, I would recommend you check out my podcast, which is Content with Character. And I actually, if you scroll through the feed, I have an episode all about like keeping them engaged and not losing them via distraction. So it's perfect right after you listen to this one. And Alicia, thank you so much for having me. I always love our conversations.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much for coming back on. And we will make sure that we have not just your podcast linked in the show notes, but also that episode specifically. So that way, if people are doing other things and they want to go listen to that episode, we'll make sure that we hyperlink to it in the show notes.
Thank you.